Welcome everyone who's here and online. My name is Leslie Porries. I am really excited to be presenting or opening this conversation around innovative financing solutions for climate resilient water, sanitation, and hygiene. I stand here with you on behalf of WaterAid, but I am not alone in this. I am joined by IDE, Sanergy Collaborative, Ecopsis, Social Finance, and the Hilton Foundation. You have a lot of minds coming here together to really unpack and explore these ideas, and we're really excited to be taking this conversation forward. And there's still me. I want to open us up a little bit by giving some context to the concept of innovative finance. We've all been hearing about this. Some of us have been in this space for quite some time. And it can mean a lot of different things, and we want to sort of narrow the focus for the conversation today. You will hear a lot of discussion around results-based finance and performance-based, outcomes-based finance. That is not the only tool that we mean when we're talking about innovative finance. You will also hear about some other tools related to PPP, the role of governments. We are focusing a little bit more on performance-based or results-based finance because of the context that we're in. Many of us come from different organizations that have been doing program work for quite some time. As ODA is shifting, we are in the process of transitioning. In many cases, the performance-based outcomes and this kind of programming is a first step towards getting ourselves more comfortable and familiar with these different financial tools. It's the beginning of the journey, not the end. And the other component of this that has been raised when we were discussing this as a group ourselves was the idea that when we talk about introducing private finance, commercial finance, they require markets. A lot of us are oriented towards countries and systems where the markets aren't there yet. The markets need to be built. And this is another way of transitioning and sort of working in those contexts before they are ready for a lot of different reasons for the other types of finance. So I want to sort of put that framing and context in your mind. This is not the end of the story, it is the beginning, and it's a logical beginning. With that, I'm going to transition over to a number of colleagues that you're going to hear from the first point of the conversation today, where we really sort of look at this from a theoretical perspective. I'll just give you a hint. We will transition into a bit more of the practical applications and draw upon the experience of many of the colleagues that are with me today to really hear and unpack what this looks like for different people from different types of areas. So with that, I'm going to introduce Monica Altamirano. She's going to lead us through this first panel, and then you'll have to deal with me later again.
Thank you. It's quite an honor to be here. I think I would like to invite all of the three panelists to come here to the front. Sophie, Gufran, and Rob. Well, thank you for being here. As Leslie already introduced what the main question is, right, about what are the conditions for successful activation of innovative finance mechanisms in countries where we need to scale up climate resilient water and sanitation service delivery. Now, we have different questions for some of you. So starting with you, Rob, what do you see as the requirements, internal and external, for doing that successful transition from grant-based to results-based finance? And in the experience of social finance, what are the biggest barriers for that transition?
Thank you. I think we have a couple of slides. Is there a thing?
Wait.
Little,
Next thing, yeah.
little device? Yeah.
To the right.
Okay, yeah, okay. So, yes.
Perfect.
Oh, yes,
Right.
sorry.
Good. Right, it's me. So exploring readiness into finance, which was your question. We wrote this header, and then I looked at it again and thought, well, sounds a bit negative, actually, as it's not suited to all WASH programs. But we've locked the doors.
Speak into the mic.
We've locked the doors, so you can't escape at this point. You'll have to understand why, in some cases, this is not going to be the right approach for all organisations. Perhaps the first point from me on innovative finance is that the finance itself is really not the point. This is not going to be, for me, a presentation about finance at all. It's really going to be about outcomes and change. The point for me is that improving wash outcomes is a really difficult business. The programmatic interventions, some of the case studies we'll hear later, are quite complex things they're trying to do. It's obviously not clear up front what exactly is going to work. Things need to adapt. This is often a case of adaptive management or adaptive programming. And so the kind of funding that you have needs to be fit for purpose for these complex challenges. And that's the point of innovative finance, which is to be supportive of complex change programs, to be flexible, to be able to bring in different forms of funding to fit what's actually going on, rather than saying, here's an innovative finance approach and just follow it. So that's the kind of key thing from me. It is a means to an end. And that means that certain programs or certain interventions, certain enterprises, it's not the right fit. And there's no point trying to put if you accept the phrase, putting a square peg in a round hole. In some cases, it's just not going to be the right match. So let me just talk through what we found in the work which we have done in 4 countries with WaterAid, just very briefly. And this was applying a readiness framework to really screen for where innovative financing has potential. And the point is potential to drive better wash outcomes. And again, that's the point. I'll keep coming back to improving wash outcomes. We divided this into two parts, really. One was kind of what we thought of as being very critical elements, and a second half will be more sort of additional, nice-to-have elements. And probably the thing you'll notice is that there's nothing at all about finance in the first group here. It's really about, as I said, about change. So, things that are really important. Strategic fit. Does innovative finance fit the organisation and the programme, or whatever the actual intervention is? Questions like, is there actually appetite in the organisation to do something differently? Appetite for change management? Is there a willingness to actually focus on outcomes and to accept that sometimes outcomes aren't being met? Is there a willingness to engage, as we started off with, as Leslie said, with market-based approaches? Is there a willingness to accept new roles? And these are questions of leadership, questions of strategy and leadership. Broadly in the country, is there an enabling environment that's supportive? That could be regulatory, could also be legal, could also be the broader political environment, and all of those aspects are quite important. The funding networks. Now I'm starting to talk a little bit more about money, but it is important that there is effectively connectivity to funders who are willing to do something different. Potentially grant funders, but also, depending on what's happening in the particular country or particular program, social investors. So that sense of who might be on the journey with the organisation is really important from a funding perspective. And then market capacity. So is there an ecosystem of capable and contractable, and I'll come back to that point around being contractable, service providers, particularly for O&M. All right, so that was the critical elements we thought of for the readiness framework. And then additional elements which we felt were important, but perhaps a little bit secondary. And these are slightly more what you'd expect from a presentation on innovative finance. So the first here is a narrative on financial viability that's credible. By that I mean that some operational models, an enterprise, an organization, a program, will be consistent with certain types of funding. There's no point trying to have an operational model which isn't fit for, say, debt financing and trying to make it so. So the narrative and what you're trying to get to in terms of financial viability has to be a credible one. It may be that you're looking at results-based grant funding because there's no prospect of using returnable capital. Or maybe there is some prospect of innovative debt finance, but the narrative is important. Backed by data and evidence, so the availability of data to inform the program design and to be able to iterate around that program. As I said at the beginning, you're not going to be having a program that sticks and does the same thing in a planned way for several years. The program itself is naturally going to adapt and to evolve, with a culture in the organization of thinking about evidence, collecting it, using it, and then putting it to work. really important for innovative finance. A focus in the organization on sustained delivery. So from the way we think about it, again, going back to outcomes, a program that just focuses on gathering from funders some CapEx to deliver some infrastructure, but doesn't prioritize the ongoing functionality and use of that infrastructure, O&M, for example, or working with private providers to ensure that there's sustained delivery, well, that's not going to be a program that's well suited to innovative finance, and it's not a program that will deliver sustained results. And finally, we were screening for partnerships, that the leadership of these organizations were willing and able to build effective relationships with sometimes new partners, new stakeholders. So often some quite unexpected partnerships need to form in order to use alternative and innovative funding forms, again, with the end goal being better outcomes. So that's how we thought about this readiness framework across the countries that we looked at. Those were, just to give a sense of the type of countries we were looking at on behalf of WaterAid, this was Niger, Burkina Faso, Liberia, and Zambia. So quite a range of countries there. Just briefly then, not trying to go country by country, very quickly on the themes kind of cross-cutting. I'm not going to go through the details, I don't know, hopefully we'll share the presentations afterwards, but we divided them into sort of three buckets of cross-cutting themes. One was around the ability to sustain service delivery. We found that in many of these countries, there's a strong focus on community-led O&M approaches, which were often challenging to maintain and to deliver because of the nature of frankly, the willingness to pay or the financial situation in the communities. So just handing over a system to a community that is not resourced or technically in the right place to deliver that and sustain its service is going to result in poor ongoing service delivery. Linked to that, gaps in professional O&M, limited engagement of state-owned utilities in some rural areas, even if they have a mandate to deliver WASH. Sometimes you have a context of the responsibilities shifting to district authorities, but they themselves lack resources, lack technical capabilities in some areas. And this whole point around data and evidence often missing. Funding, cost-effective tariffs, this point around thinking carefully about OPEX, CapManEx, and CapEx, and who's doing what, was something which we looked at quite carefully. And then a theme which came up quite a lot actually in this screening was around the role of climate and carbon finance and how that can be supportive. And then finally, and very briefly, a point on partnerships and this point around, is there a willingness to engage in new types of partnerships to think about the often broader and more complex set of relationships that are needed. So that's where we got to in terms of three sets of cross-cutting themes for those countries off the back of a readiness framework. And that's enough from me. If I press this one more time, we should get to Gufran.
Well, I would just one moment. So thank you. I think what is good to take over along really very important messages is that you were saying that the innovative finance is because we need that innovation and that tailoring, right, to what you want to achieve. And two other things I would like to take over is that the part of leadership, I think, and with who you do that, which sometimes we maybe forget. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask, indeed, Gufran, Mansour, maybe my French is not very good, but...
It's Arabic, we can work on it.
Oh, okay, that's... yeah, I mean, you will tell us about this study and on PPP feasibility for water services in Ghana. So we would love to know how does the results of this study indicate, what do they indicate when it comes to innovative finance for water services, and even though it was focused in Ghana, how
Sure.
let's say, can you translate those lessons to other regions and countries?
Okay, I will try. Thank you. Yeah, I'm very happy to share some of the key results from this feasibility study. I wanted to give a shout out to my colleagues in Ghana, Maple Consult, so I hope some of them are online or here. Yeah, so it's a PPP, it's a feasibility study on public-private partnerships. It was funded by the Hilton Foundation, also acknowledging that. So the study focused really on 2 small towns in the northern part of the country. Ghana actually is quite deprived when it comes to access to piped water services. So the areas here marked in whitish color indicate where we need more piped water. And I just want to give ourselves a reminder that piped water supply is the standard that we need to achieve. I just want to think, hopefully this is all what we are working towards too. Piped water at home, to gain the full benefits of water supplies. So with this in mind, we did a study to see whether we could bring in the private sector to contribute to financing the investment required in small towns in Ghana. So we did this assessment specifically in 2 small towns. Of course, we recognize that these are not representatives of all of Ghana, but I think quite a large chunk of Ghana, at least 200 plus towns fit into the same characteristics. These are towns with access to piped water ranging between 30 to 60%, but even when access is as high as 60%, they still face, populations still face rationing due to production capacity. And, this is a session on climate and innovative finance for, climate resilient wash services. And climate has a real impact on the availability of water supply in Ghana, but of course elsewhere. And this means that it's increasingly expensive to produce water. And this reflects in the costs that came out from the study. We actually measured the kilometers of pipe that we needed to construct, the treatment solutions that we need to provide, or the government needs to provide, or whoever party needs to provide, so that people have access to piped water services. And if you look at, for these 2 towns, each towns, I think the costs are about $6 to $7 million US each, which is actually quite high considering the number of people. And this is driven really by the production of water, and because you have to go a little bit further out of town now to find adequate water supply in sufficient quantities. So the feasibility study was carried out based on 3 main components. The first one being the technical assessment, so I already touched on that, which really highlighted the costs of extending services, so the capital costs required. We also estimated the operational costs, but maybe I can touch on that a bit later. We also had the institutional part in the assessment, and for us, it wasn't a big hurdle. When you do such a study, you assess these different components to see whether any of these would be significant barriers for the private sector to enter that market. And the institutional side, I wouldn't say is the biggest hurdle, and reforms could be implemented quite easily if there was political commitment. I think what I would stress on is more the financial results. So we estimated the total cost of producing 1 cubic meter of water and servicing people, and the total cost came to about, including OPEX over the lifetime of I wouldn't say the lifetime of the asset, over the PPP timeframe, which was actually a 20-year. We modeled a 20-year concession contract, and within that time frame, we estimated the total cost would be about $1.5 US per cubic meter. And then when you compare that with the existing tariff, and that's where you can see clearly the funding gap. So we're talking here about 1.1 cubic meter, $1.1 US per cubic meter. So clearly, just by these numbers, you can see that the investment would not be at all viable from a private sector perspective. Commercial rates, anyway, are very high. We're talking about 60% plus, and with a very short tenor for loans, for business loans. So obviously, all these elements, unsurprisingly, point out to the fact that attracting the private sector to such part of Ghana, or maybe in other contexts, is not possible under existing market conditions. But then, having carried out this study or this kind of groundwork, we had the data now to model whether blended finance could be possible and under what conditions. And that's the next part. I hope I have time for.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
So this is where we come to blended finance as a potential solution. So blended finance refers to the use of public funds to mobilize additional private capital towards SDG goals. So these are, and sorry, it's a bit late, and I realize that maybe there are too many numbers. So the point is not to understand all the numbers, but this gives you a highlight of our approach and some of the key results may be worth reflecting on. So the approach was to really plug in some assumptions. I'm not going to read the whole list, but say, for example, extending a long payback period for the private sector, doubling tariff gradually by 2030, also modeling increased water consumption. I know that 6 liters per capita per day seems high. I was at a session earlier where the presenter talked about 7 liters per capita per day, but here I think we're talking about piped water at home, so hopefully by 2030, Ghanaians and others will be able to use a lot of water. We also plugged in some efficiency gains, but most importantly, we plugged in a viability gap, because as we saw earlier, it was not possible to assume that the private sector could recover its investments just by the tariff. So we had to plug in a viability gap. So on the right-hand side, you see some of the key results. So in addition to plugging the assumptions, we did some modeling to see, okay, if the private sector put in the 100% of the capital investments, okay, what is the results on the viability of the investments, and same thinking for 70% or 30% of the capital investment. And the results are quite interesting because they show that there is not one scenario that is the scenario, because both parties have different interests and both parties bear different costs. So, for example, in the scenario 1, when you have all the investment that that is made by the private sector, the viability gap, say, is 30% provided by the public institutions. The internal rate of return is 4%. But if you compare that with the last scenario where the private sector is putting 30% of the capex, and then the IRR gets better for the private sector, but clearly this has a much higher cost for on the government side. So I think here what I would like to, what I did not mention, the most important part is concessional finance. Our model assumes finance provided at 2% interest rate, so deeply, deeply, deeply concessional, and that's what we need to work on, I think, more. How can we really make available repayable finance at that deep concessional rate? So I just wanted to mention this word of trade-off. My main conclusion from this, there needs to be discussions. If governments or other actors are committed to private sector participation and to private capital as part of the solution, we need to discuss. We need to get the data on the investment needed and the OPEX, get all this data together and discuss what are the trade-offs that need to be made and what agreement needs to happen between the public and private side. Thank you.
Thank you, Gufran. I think it was great to see how you started with partnerships. You went deeper into one of these types, and your point on the trade-off, right? And where do you get the deeply concessional finance? With that in mind, I would like to go to Sophie Tremolet. Oh, sorry, you have. Okay, maybe you take it here. Yes, and so as you can expect, because Sophie is the lead of where at the OECD, the question is also around regulatory reform. So what kind of regulatory reforms do you see as most needed to align these new models and partnerships when governments are typically hesitating to go that way, right? And in addition, also noting that the OECD is encouraging the public development banks to be part of the solution. How do you see them as part of this whole changing landscape?
Thank you, thank you, Monica. I apologize for my voice, which is a bit crooked, but I'll try to do my best. So thanks a lot for the presentations that preceded. I think your questions are about how do we incentivize innovative finance from a government's perspective, but the term innovative finance can mean many different things. We also want to look at it from the point of view of providers of finance. How can we diversify also the types of providers of finance? Hence this question about the role that public development banks can play. Because in reference to what Gufran was saying, terms of very low rate of investment, of rate of return expectations, we need to look at sources of finance that can provide deeply concessional finance and not be associated with an exchange rate risk. So in terms of the type of policy reforms, I mean, it's nothing groundbreaking what I'll say, but I think one of the key factor for attracting private sector participation, private finance, is that of transparency and clarity in terms of definition of results, right? There's been a lot of emphasis on results-based financing, and all of that can be fostered through having better regulatory frameworks in place so that we can have visibility, knowledge of assets, knowledge of quality of these assets, which are mostly buried. What if you are talking about a concession contract or a sort of service contract, what are these private sector getting themselves into, but also what is going to be expected of them, how is it going to be measured. So we're seeing quite a lot of interest right now for reforms of regulation, which may or may not be through the creation of a single regulatory agency, but we are seeing renewed interest for that type of approach. I will take an example, that of Senegal, which can be contrasted with that of Benin. I mean, in Senegal, there's been a long-standing tradition of regulation by contract, which has applied to urban service providers. They try to do the same in rural areas, but with mixed results, partly because of this lack of transparency. So, for example, they had tendered out some contracts which didn't find any bidders for rural contracts because they hadn't done the due diligence on asset evaluation and the rules were not clear enough. There's also a lot of requirement coming from the public for greater transparency, because a lot of this regulation by contract is perceived to be behind closed door, between the sort of asset holding company and the private operator. So you might have heard that the government change in Senegal, the new president, one of its first decisions, actually, given the importance of water, was to say that they wanted to create a new regulatory agency that would effectively harmonize also the regulatory regimes across the different types of operators. Because I think what we're seeing now, in 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there was a lot of emphasis on the large urban providers, but now there's many more providers that have come to the fore and that are becoming more professionalized, so that deserve as well a better integrated regulatory regime. So the OECD is assisting the government with setting up that regulatory agency, and we're doing the same in the Philippines as well, because there, similarly, there's a lot of fragmentation in the sector. There's multiple regimes that have emerged over time. So all of this calls for better harmonization of regulatory regimes, for transparency, as I mentioned, greater emphasis on KPIs that can be clearly defined in a harmonized manner, but also tariffs. We have to talk about tariffs. How can stronger regulation, including through the creation of a regulatory agency, depoliticize the tariff setting regime? And that was one of your criteria in your readiness framework assessment. So these, I would say, would be an important first step. The regulation of quality indicators is important and can be also help and prepare the ground for results-based financing regime, because if you have very clear benchmarks, then you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you set up a new RBF scheme. I think the other type of reform that is important, and we saw on your map of Ghana, there's a lot of fragmentation of service provision, often because service provision is seen as a municipal service. But in order to attract innovative finance with RBF scheme, which are quite time-consuming to put in place, a critical reform is that of grouping service providers together. And this is what was done, for example, in Benin, where we we went from a very fragmented, service provision with experimentation to bring in small-scale private providers at local level, which had some successes but was not fully successful. So then the government, it didn't set up regulatory regime, but what it did is that it created free service areas in the country and let out contracts on that basis to private operators. A key thing, and you talked about concessional finance, is that the government decided to take upon itself all the initial investment cost or rehabilitation cost of a system, something that hadn't been done in Senegal, for example, and then let out the contract in a transparent manner. And that's been very instrumental in getting much more household pipe supply to rural communities in Ghana. And on the basis of the success of this exercise, we're now taking that to the urban sector, which is quite interesting, starting with rural and then going back to urban. So I think these are, some of the regulatory reforms I would highlight. On the provision of finance side, this is where diversifying the sources of financing is important. I don't know if some of you followed the financing for development discussions in Sevilla last July. And in the context of reduction in ODA, there's more and more calls for domestic resource mobilization. So far, there's been a lot of focus on what the role of commercial banks might be. What we're doing now, and as OECD will be launching next month, the Public Development Banks for Water initiative, because we strongly believe that there is a greater role that public development banks can play. Right now, they are not investing massively in water, except with some exceptions in South Africa, in Brazil. There's some efforts in Vietnam, but collectively, these public development banks have actually a much greater weight than multilateral development banks. And multilateral development banks invest about 5 to 10% of their portfolio in water. Public development banks is more in the region of 1 to 2. So if these public development banks were to increase the share of their portfolio to water, we could almost bridge or fill the financing gap that we've been talking about for so long. So, but that requires engaging, even at project level, looking for the right types of financial institutions that can support these deals and educating them. So from an OECD perspective or coalition perspective, we will be engaging with those banks at technical assistance level, but I believe on the project definition front, seeking out those development banks is also very essential. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sophie. I think one thing I would like to, there were very interesting insights, but the need for transparency and clarity, harmonization and standardization of those contracts in a way resonate with the trade-off you were speaking about, but then how do we go deeper that the transaction costs are also less in that process? And of course, you mentioned a number of interventions like quality regulation that is very promising. Now, you have heard the three panelists, and now the idea is also that you can make questions. So we are opening the floor for your questions. Yes, here.
I'm afraid my name's Gavin McGillivray. I'm a non-executive director of LUWAT, which provides waterless sanitation systems in Madagascar and South Africa. I was previously with the UK Department for International Development, very much involved with public-private partnerships. And I just wanted to share one experience we had, because I very much agreed with Sophie that mobilizing local domestic investment, domestic lending, is one, there's a lot of opportunity there, but also it's the right sort of money because it comes in local currency, and it comes here from providers who understand the environment, which international investors don't so well. So together with the Netherlands, Sweden and Switzerland, the UK created something called the Private Infrastructure Development Group, which is a group of facilities that provide lending, project development and guarantees for infrastructure in developing countries, with an emphasis on the poorer developing countries. In Nigeria, in about 2018, I think, they created a facility specifically to incentivize local pension funds and local insurance funds to invest in infrastructure. So it's called InfraCredit. And what it does is when a company wants to issue a bond to invest in infrastructure, InfraCredit guarantees that bond, and so it makes it more acceptable to the pension funds and the insurance funds. And at the same time, InfraCredit provides advice to the pension funds and the insurance funds, which are curiously sort of uninformed about the opportunities of investing in infrastructure in their own countries. So helping them understand, helping them structure the transaction, and it's proved very successful. More than 20 companies have issued bonds guaranteed by InfraCredit, and so the Private Infrastructure Development Group, the PIDG, has replicated the model in Pakistan, in Kenya, and in Southeast Asia. I just wanted to mention that as an example of innovative finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other question? Here we have one all the way. Oh, okay. It will be a collaborative effort. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. Rich, please.
Yeah, very good. All right. Thank you. Rich Thorsten, water.org. Sophie, you mentioned the importance of, or the potential opportunity of working with national development banks. I think in our experience, we've also seen some great partnerships emerge in partnering with national development banks to work with financial institutions and also as a source of investment on the infrastructure side. My question is, have you seen any interesting examples or lessons where national development banks have used results-based financing to support activities beyond traditional lending, whether it's in the water and sanitation sector or in other related development sectors?
Well, the quick answer is I don't know, because we are sort of, really initiating that, launching this initiative. But I think what we're seeing is that if it's been more traditional lending and on lending to small municipalities. So I think I don't know for certain, but my guess is that it's unlikely because they're not there yet in terms of sophistication. What we're seeing is that some of these banks are active, and including in developed countries. So, in my country, in France, the Caisse des Dépôts, and to your point about pension funds, what is interesting is that some of these development banks are set up to receive savings as well. So they're almost like pension funds themselves. That's the case in France, where they've been receiving since the mid-19th century. That's the model that was set up. They've been receiving the proceeds of the livret A, which is, every French person has a livret A, which is effectively then something that can be deployed for development finance by the Caisse des Dépôts et Consignations. So that's how it was framed, as receiving deposits and then on lending. And what's interesting is their mandate has diversified away from just being focused on water infrastructure to financing the whole water cycle. So they're quite big on freshwater restoration as well. And sort of, but this is traditional lending. I think before we push them towards resource-based financing, the main point of entry is to make sure that they understand what water sector investment is, not just WASH, but it could be, also water for agriculture, water for energy efficient processes, in industrial processes, because they are very involved in energy lending and energy efficiency lending. So we want to make sure that they can consider water efficiency as well. And I think with the increase in prominence of the water-related risks, that helps our case in some way. But to the point about microfinance, I think they could, they know the landscape, so they could be a very good sort of relay as well to feed into the financial system via microfinance institutions. So I'd be very curious to continue the conversation and to hear more about your experiences. Thank you.
Tack så mycket. Hi, I'm Alexandra Chevalier. I'm a colleague of Leslie's. I work at WaterAid, and I'm the EU representative. In the previous session held in this room, we talked about the EU water resilience strategy. And so in terms of that strategy's external component, increases in blended finance models, support to multilateral or national development banks, seems to take on a bigger role, also linked to what Sophie was saying in terms of the ODA trends that were brought up at FF4D. So my question would be sort of linking this discussion to the policymaking programming side. If you had to give 2-3 recommendations to whether it's the EU or other OECD DAC members on how to, yes, what would be the best approaches for increased blended finance, as we also see at the same time much more support globally moving towards water investments. So I know maybe 2-3 is quite challenging, but what should the DAC focus on, basically as these models are more prominent, becoming more prominent? Thank you.
Do you want me to answer? Or well, I think project preparation is important, and in fact, in the EU water resilience strategy, I mean, it is very much EU focused, but as you said, there is an international component that can, with water resilience incubator, there's also a water academy, so there's a strong emphasis on making sure that there are technical assistance being provided, including also through the European Investment Bank. So that would be one main activity, and then engaging on policy reforms is often something that is not necessarily prioritized, but can yield a lot of benefits, and that can be delinked from project preparation. And this is what we do at the OECD. We engage in policy dialogue, and we emphasize that this can be very separate from specific loans, and because governments need to have that advice. They do get this advice at the moment through multilateral development banks. You know, the World Bank or ADB would have some engagement, but it's important that they can get a neutral sort of assessment of what these key conditions for unlocking finance might need to be. So that's the type of work we're doing in the Philippines or Senegal, is really, going back to the drawing board and saying what are the key blockers, and in those cases it was regulation that really came to the fore, and this is something that takes time. You know, these processes are not 5-year cycle like you may have in a landing project, so it's useful to take a little bit more time and do that in a delinked manner from project preparation. But this is hard to fund, and there's not always a lot of resources going to these longer term processes. So that's where I would suggest the EU focuses on.
Oh, Cayetano.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cayetano Hetzer from Waste. So this resonates very well, well-known challenges since a long time, and I'm happy that you are taking it to the next level, making it more concrete and also to action it. And so since this is an opportunity, having a multi-stakeholder audience here, so what do you need? How could we possibly contribute? What is, and you already indicated some, but is there some list of opportunities, some follow-up, how we can contribute to take it forward, to support this, and the other way around also? So what are the next steps maybe to chip in?
Fran, maybe you want to think, for example.
There's always a next step. Let's see. I think Sophie pointed out to some initiatives ongoing that I think would welcome contributions. So I think you talked about launching something related to public development banks. I think keeping an eye on this. I think in terms of concrete action, this is, for example, a concrete initiative that is coming up. We have here others from WaterAid that have initiatives contributing to these initiatives. Would be helpful. I don't know whether I'm answering the question, but there are initiatives existing, and your presence here, thank you very much for your presence, and keeping an eye, and not reinventing the wheel, I think would be good.
But if I may, I think what is useful is also to have a feedback from project developers, such as Waste, in terms of what are the policy barriers that you've met? What would make a difference to accelerate not only the project preparation process, but also access to finance and delivery of a project. So having this constant sort of exchange, frank and honest discussion in terms of what your challenges are and suggestions about policy processes can be helpful. And one of the tools that we've developed at the OECD is a scorecard for assessing the enabling environment for investing in water that we use. It's a scorecard. It's quite a sort of numerical process, but what we try to do as well is to engage stakeholders when we do that. So it's not just a consultancy-based exercise. We've applied it in Armenia, for example, and that was a good way of effectively assessing the enabling environment across multiple dimensions, because that's the key issue, is that, investing in water, the biggest blocker might be something to do with governance rules for private entities, right? So something that is totally unrelated to the water sector, but is a blockage. So having an instrument such as that enables you to have inter-ministerial dialogue and multi-stakeholder dialogue, and assess it on a open table, if you want. But that's where developers need to be willing to share their own challenges and do that maybe in a non-competitive environment, because there is always that risk that you keep things close to your chest or don't want to reveal, your challenges, so that you don't compromise opportunities.
Maybe I would like, please, Rob, because you talk about the readiness, and so how do you see, and a lot about the who? So this question of Kajetan, how would you?
Well, I have a slightly controversial response to all of this, which is that most of the conversation, I think, has been on the more commercial end, or perhaps more the middle income end, where so for example, just summarising, public development banks, but as you've noted, trying to get them to put greater allocations into WASH is a challenge. Gavin, you're talking about some of the credit de-risking facilities, such as through PIDGE, to improve the flow of funding from local commercial banks. We talked about this as well. But as Gufran pointed out, the terms of financing may be feasible, or also some of the project finance terms of financing may be feasible for investable projects in higher income settings. But when we're talking about Ghana, your point, Gufran, was that terms of financing which are short tenor, high interest rates, are really ineffective for managing to bring water services to low-income populations that simply can't afford them. So my challenge then is, my question really is, as you pointed out, we need some blending. Potentially, to improve water outcomes for these lower income, lower willingness to pay populations, we need a huge amount of blending. And the question is, how much blending is too much? What is the right, going back to Sevilla, what is the right allocation of constrained ODA resources? And this can be cash ODA, or they could be in the same way as when you put a credit de-risking facility in place. It does score against ODA, so it does constrain ODA that can then be used in lower income settings. Where should we be placing our focus in terms of middle income, larger capex projects versus some of the left behind populations? And we have also a range of focus areas here. And where we were coming from with water aid was countries like Niger, Burkina Faso, where the conversation about commercial financing, even with de-risking mechanisms, simply isn't possible. So I want us to not lose sight of that as well.
Well, thank you very Transitions are difficult.
I mean, the case of Benin is interesting, because in terms of blending, they decided to, allocate substantial public funding
on budget, which is brilliant.
On budget, which is, through a World Bank loan. So, it's in order to pay for the capital investment for new infrastructure or rehabilitation for existing infrastructure. Right. But then that's enabling them to have operating management in place that ensures the sustainability of these services, which is always, the key thing in terms of, and that's a key benefit in itself. And Benin is not particularly middle income either, right? And it contrasts with, the case of Senegal, which is a little bit higher income, but was not able to do that. So I think there are models which can work in terms of gradually increasing the role of private sector for operations in the first instance, and then you can move towards a little bit more capex, gradually, but not trying to do too much too fast, I think is critical.
So I agree. A sort of smart use of resources, which is in a targeted way to deal with the capex problem. Ooh. Yes.
Okay.
Go on.
No, it's time for us to leave.
Well, I mean, no, thank you very much. I think you have given to the audience really a taste of that complex and changing environment, navigating trade-offs, also expectations that they are clear. And I think what I myself also take very much is the worrying issue, though, that you said that as climate is impacting the water cycle, there's less availability, water becomes more expensive to produce. So we already had a problem, and that problem is even more challenging. And so, not to depress you, but how do we finance that transition? So, and with that, we have our transition with Leslie.
And we have a Mentimeter as well, right? We want to actually take some of your reflections. Yes. It's very large. You should be able to pick it up on your phone without too much of a difficulty right now. And a convenient moment for us to transition to the next round. I hope you all found that fascinating. I really wanted to interject and held myself back. You may hear it a little bit in some of the closing comments, however. But yes, I think it would be a great moment to invite the next round of wonderful ladies to the stage. Hope you all appreciate how many strong and really insightful female voices we have here. It's quite exciting. We'll give you a chance. And you can see which of the areas discussed do you think would be the hardest to overcome in your country? And we can see that you are we'll give you a few more minutes before we show you what you all actually think. And actually, let's go ahead and move to the screen now. Let's see what we're doing. Okay, so we have 40 people potentially answering. We've got about half of you have answered. But I think we're seeing everyone seems like readiness to make your own programmatic changes is not necessarily what is holding people back. I actually think sometimes in certain cases it might be, but that's not what the room feels, so that's excellent. The policy and regulatory changes, I'll just talk about this while you're doing it because I wanted to share. It was actually a really exciting learning I had yesterday in one of these other sessions where we had a member of WASREB, the Kenyan regulatory agency, and what she highlighted and what she was showcasing was actually what they've been doing because of climate change. They actually have been building climate resilience. They've done a whole set of regulations for climate resilient sanitation that are being cascaded across the 47 counties of Kenya. And they took that on themselves, and they, as the regulator, are forcing that. And that shows how climate change, which is where we were sort of ending this with Monica's point, can be forcing certain regulatory changes for better climate resilience. How that is being financed, they are working on that, et cetera. But it does show that there is some appetite in certain cases, maybe for the wrong reasons in terms of a changing climate that we have to address and deal with. But I thought it was really fascinating and a learning that you can have in an environment like this. I think that whole readiness, I think that whole regulatory changes is where most of the people in this room do see the difficulties because we know that this is hard. And I think we also know that when we as a community are talking about finance, we get very excited about the transactions and the deals, but it's actually a lot of the messy regulatory policy stuff that will facilitate that finance later that is actually areas where we're very well situated to contribute. And so it's just this idea of how do we get it right? But with all of that and my rambling, it gets exciting, we can move forward. Right? And today we are now really digging into the practice. Some of you in the room have already highlighted the work you've been doing. We have a lovely panel of experienced expertise with us here today. I will just preface this with one of our colleagues was supposed to be calling in, and she has been unable to do that. So we are sad, but that means we get more time to focus on these three cases here. We have Elise Mann, who is Director of WASH at IDE. We have Elizabeth Maruri from Fresh Life and Sanergy Collaborative. And we have Ella Lazarte, who is now the CEO of the Resilient Water Accelerator, but spent a long time and is well known to many of us through driving private finance at USAID. And so between all of this, we can really sort of look at the practical and how all of these pieces really do fit together, just as the previous panel said we need to do and have more of a consistent orientation around, or conversation. So with that, I'm gonna start with Elise. And many of you will know IDE, when we have been talking about innovative finance, they issued a development impact bond some years ago. They actually worked very closely with social finance in the design and deployment of that bond. And what we want to hear about now is what's been happening with that since now, like really understand. We want to know how easy or how hard it was to operate in a results-based financing model compared with traditional ways of work. What did you learn? Are you planning to do more of them? Why or why not? And some of the things that she's going to say just, link very clearly back to some of the points that were raised a moment ago.
Thanks, Leslie. Hi, everyone. Real pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. Thanks for making it Wednesday at 4 p.m. And I'm glad today to be speaking on behalf of my colleagues from IDE Cambodia. I hope they're not online because it's quite late. But really, since we're here to talk about outcomes and impact, they're the ones that have delivered this work and really driven the outcomes that we've seen. So I think it was fun. It's fun to follow the panel we just had because there's a lot of things that were said that I think we've really experienced. So I think my 3 takeaways that I'll tell you a little bit more about is around the importance of being aligned on your outcome and the incentives for all of the stakeholders involved. You really need to have a pretty good sense of your core operational model and the costs of that model to be well established so you can think about how to design this well. And then also your verification process. We need transparency, but also simplicity to make sure that it can move forward quickly. So, as many of you know, in 2019, we launched the Cambodia Rural Sanitation Bond. So we had been working across Cambodia to build markets for sanitation since 2009 in Cambodia, and had started working with Stone Family Foundation in 2012. So they had been along the ride with us for a long time. In 2009, sanitation coverage was around 22%, 23% nationally. And then when we started on the path of the development impact bond, it was around 66, 68%. And so we were really using this mechanism to figure out how to reach that next 20% of people with coverage. So we now have, to talk about scale, over 410,000 toilets that have been sold in rural Cambodia since 2009. So that translates to 1 in every 5 rural Cambodian households have an IDE facilitated toilet. So in 2019, in partnership with Stone Family Foundation and USAID, and a lot of engagement and work with Rob and social finance, we launched the world's first wash dib. And the aim was to support ODF declarations, so making sure we are getting to that outcome level, not an output level of latrines sold, which is really what our focus had been before that. And we wanted to reach 1,600 villages across 6 provinces in Cambodia. We overperformed. The final number was 1,780 villages, and that translates to about 500,000 households that claimed ODF. So what I want to highlight there is we hadn't been doing work in ODF up until that date. And so I actually joined IDE right around the time that we launched this mechanism. And that was also a couple months before the pandemic, which leads to an important message around adaptability and flexibility. But so this first message here is around being aligns on outcomes and incentives. So for USAID, it was an opportunity, really great risk-free investment. Stone only got paid if we met our results. For the Stone Family Foundation, who had been along with us for almost a decade, they got to move from being in this grantor relationship to us to an impact investor and make a financial return. And then for IDE, it helped us to build on our core operational model and think about how we could work even more closely with local government to still reach the folks that were open to defecating. And I think the adaptive management piece here that's really important was evolving that model. We worked with grassroots public-private partnerships teams to engage with local government. Because of the flexibility of the mechanism, we could ramp up operations and recruit appropriately when we needed to across provinces. And with the pandemic, we were able to adjust as COVID got worse across Cambodia and make the decisions that were necessary to both keep everybody safe and stay engaged with the local government and the national government priorities for pandemic response. And that also allowed us to integrate some of those messages and work in vaccinations to support not only ODF, but other health outcomes across Cambodia. So beyond the alignment on clear outcomes, we really experienced the importance of operating at a reasonable scale so that we could cost it out. DIBs are often critiqued for being overly complicated, but that was a little bit easier for us to navigate because there were 3 stakeholders. You had Stone as the impact investor, USAID as the outcome buyer, and IDE as the implementing partner. And that still took us 9 months to negotiate. So the more stakeholders you have, the more complicated it's going to get in terms of making the agreements that you want to reach so that everybody is happy and everybody receives what they want to receive. And another piece here is our verification process was relatively simple for DIBs. The more complicated they are, the longer that's going to take. And it can also get really expensive really fast, which means then you're spending money on your external validator instead of on your impact and what you want to do with your programming. And our verification had to be auditable, but we were able to negotiate the sampling, which made it much easier and allowed us to move forward more quickly. So the last piece of your question on if we are going to continue to use this mechanism, we have tried to replicate it in Cambodia to really finish the job there. We worked with a number of different potential investors and potential outcome buyers to think about that last 15% in terms of coverage, really focused on climate resilient sanitation and those in more rural areas. And we've also tried to pitch it in Bangladesh, where we have a really large scale program and have been working there for over a decade as well. But it's hard to find an outcome buyer. That has really been our challenge. So to your question earlier about what we can do, if you are a funder interested in this kind of mechanism, Michel Duguay, who was our WASH director at the time and is IDE's finance expert, he asked me to say in this presentation to stop focusing on BVAs and instead focus on impact. And so while the mechanism is, I think, really powerful and one that served us really, really well, it's really hard to find the right people to be involved there. And so that transparency, but the relationship, the ability to work so closely with Stone and USAID was really critical to the success that the team had.
Thank you for that. And I want to highlight the point, because I know, and we had talked about this before also, right? You emphasized that you had been working with Stone Family Foundation for
almost a decade.
Almost a decade, which made them more willing to take on this kind of experience and journey with you, right? And I think it was also the point that Rob was highlighting back at the beginning around sort of really understanding and lining up your finance, right? And so we can presume we have something amazing and wonderful, but that in itself might take a lot more work. And I think this is super helpful to so many of us. We all talk about the bonds, so it's just really great to hear from you. So thank you. I'm going to move on to Elizabeth from Fresh Life. I think many, and so this takes us over largely to Kenya. It would be great if you could share a little bit with us about the sort of Sanergy model and what it does and what it pursues. We probably could have opened with IDE's work in that way, sorry. But then I want to hear from you, how do you collaborate with duty bearers for sanitation provision in a way that encourages the evolution to independent financing models and doesn't encourage dependency on development actors, right? When it comes, we don't want a situation where we as NGOs or nonprofits are continually just doing this for forever and ever. So when it comes to innovative finance and PPPs, what have been the biggest constraints and where do you see opportunities for improvement?
Great. Thank you, Leslie. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth. Sanergy and Fresh Life. So we are, okay.
Sorry.
Oh, I've got, all right, great. So we offer non-sewered sanitation, specifically container-based sanitation in Nairobi, Kenya, Eldoret, which is another city in Kenya, and Kisumu. We're operational in 3 cities in Kenya, and we recently moved to Lusaka, Zambia. So we complement the government to offer sanitation services to our people through a non-sewered sanitation model, and specifically we deal with urban informal settlements. We look at cities where there's been rapid urbanization, where people have progressed to the city and the city does not have the capacity to offer essential services to the residents. And so in that case, in point, for example, in Nairobi, we only have about 50% coverage in sewer sanitation. So we come in to support the government to ensure that the low-income communities, especially those that live in informal settlements, have access to safely managed sanitation. We have a circular economy or circular approach to waste management. In addition to providing safely managed sanitation, we also actually convert that waste into regenerative agricultural products, specifically organic fertilizer, animal feed, which is protein-based, and last but not least, biomass briquettes, which we use within the factory or the recycling factory. So that is a bit about Sanergy or Fresh Life. So we've been operational since 2011, 2012, so we're about 14, 15 years. And up until 5 years ago, we had not managed to work in collaboration with the government. We, of course, definitely had government touch points, but we didn't have any formal partnership or any formalized collaboration with the government. And yeah, as we said, it's really interesting how sometimes we can support the government to do something, but then there is a lot of reliance on donor funding because we've been operating for 14 years and not largely, but fully financed by donors and grants. So one of the things that we decided to do, especially when we were moving to new cities, is to ensure that we collaborate with the government. We have a government policy and advocacy team that has really been working hand in hand with the government, trying to get into the right places, trying to get into the right forums, from the ministry, which is the national government, to the county, to the utility or what we call the water service providers, to ensure that we keep advocating for the work that we are doing, and most importantly, showing them the benefit of the work that we actually do. And after a lot of advocacy, discussions, and all those things, we finally managed to sign an MOU with one utility partner in Kisumu, the Kisumu Water and Sanitation Company, and we were able to successfully launch Fresh Life services in Kisumu in partnership with the government, which was really, really a milestone for us. And shortly thereafter, we did the same in Eldoret, where we were able to work with the utility company. And last year, our greatest milestone was signing an MOU with Nairobi Water, where we had been operational for 14 years, whom we had really tried to get on board, but finally they were able to see the value, especially of other partnerships with the other utilities. And so here we are. And one of the things that we've been doing now, back to Leslie's questions on how we want to discourage or how we work with our duty bearers, who is the government, to reduce donor dependency. One, first and foremost, is we have to start from a national framework, from policies and regulation, which we have said is the hardest thing, but it is also a very, very critical entry point. It was not our first entry point, but I'll start with that because for Kenya to achieve sanitation coverage by 2030, the targets were 80% sewer, provide 80% sewer systems and 20% non-sewered sanitation. But through a lot of advocacy, through a lot of showcasing what innovations through CBS and other forms of non-sewered sanitation can do, by showcasing a model that has been implemented and is working and is scalable, we've been able to work with the government, showcase our outcomes, showcase how it's working, showcase the success of the model, and have discussions around why CBS and innovations in sanitation is important. And through that, we are happy to at least say, this week, last week, or we are planning to launch a national sanitation management policy. The government will be launching that. And the success of that is that at least we can see that the government has reduced or revised its targets. And now for Kenya to achieve sanitation coverage, we are looking at 60% non-sewered sanitation and 40% sewered sanitation. This would not have been possible without a partner who is actually able to showcase that these models work. They can be implemented, they're actually serving the people, and they're effective in terms of servicing the people. The other thing that we've been doing very, very often is capacity building, because the government does not have that capacity at some point to innovate. Neither sometimes do they have the ability or the funds to actually put in the effort to try new innovative models. And because we are there, we've been implementing for 14 years, we have the knowledge, we have the technical know-how. We then work very closely with the government to train them on exactly why it is that we are doing what we are doing. And the training is not on implementation, but most importantly, what we've been focusing on is co-fundraising and co-financing models with the government, because we've realized that some projects or some funding can be unlocked through government-led projects as opposed to private sector-led projects. So we train the government and especially utility companies on how to fundraise, how to write proposals, how to structure different models so that they can unlock funding, how to revise their strategic plans, maybe the 5-year strategic plan to incorporate both non-sewered and sewered sanitation components, because a lot of fundraising or a lot of financing that goes into sanitation was purely on infrastructure, either building sewer lines or if not, upgrading the already existing sewer lines that have been in existence for quite a long time and they're no longer efficient. So with that capacity building, we've been able to see a lot of positivity from the government partners who have now also created finance departments that also focus on fundraising. And together we've actually been able to successfully submit several proposals with different utilities, at the same time working very closely with the Water Sector Trust Fund to also work on applications which we can unlock, especially, for example, for Africa Climate Fund or green climate financing, where we have to work with a government partner to actually unlock some of this funding. Currently, we are working very closely with Nairobi Water and Water Sector Trust Fund to actually submit a proposal to Africa Development Bank through the Africa Water Facility, Africa Urban Sanitation Initiative, AUSI, so that then we can be able to structure something that is threefold. It's not led by Fresh Life, because AFDB would be really looking to fund the government as well as the sector trust fund, but we are working together, we are leading the process, we are drawing the models, but we are doing this hand in hand with the government so that we are able to unlock such opportunities as well. So there are a number of things that we are looking into. Perhaps last but not least, we worked with social finance very closely to launch RBF, results-based financing at Fresh Life. We are 1 year into RBF and has been very, very successful. It took us a while as well to figure out how, to showcase our metrics, how to measure them, how to structure them into something that outcome funders can actually buy into. But with a lot of effort and support from social finance, we were able to get 2 outcome funders on board, and as it is right now, we have 4 outcome funders on board. But why RBF was important for us is because it was a pathway to actually starting or exploring paid service contracts by the government, because it was a way for us to showcase that you can actually pay the private sector on verified outcomes or on results-based outcomes. And what we did is we created or we formed an advisory board that is largely comprised of the private sector, the sanitation actors, but most importantly, the Kenyan government sanitation stakeholders, and that is the ministry, the regulator, WASREB, what Leslie was talking about, and other sector players, so that then we are able to ensure that we work together. They understand how the process works. They actually help us to align RBF to national priorities. They start to incorporate this kind of thinking into PPP frameworks, so that then it becomes easier for them to think of how actually can we unlock, or how can we actually use this model to also contract private sector companies like Fresh Life to provide services, because at the end of the day, it is the mandate of the government to provide sanitation services, and our hope is that as we scale and for us to become sustainable, fully sustainable, and serve the 1 million people that we are looking to serve, we do need the government to contract us to offer those services to the people, and that way then we can have a blend of public financing as well as donor financing.
Wow, thank you. And I think that was, I can't summarize it very well, but I do think it's really nice to hear actually how you really do have to blend these different, you need the project work, you need the government, you need to work with the government, socialize the government, then the government works with you. All right, it's just this long process. And what was really jumping into my head at this point was also how hard it would be to enter, if we have a fly, how hard it would be to enter this space as a total newcomer, right? And so when we were talking earlier in the last session, or the last panel, about the relationship between what can those of us who are already engaged do, right? We need to partner with the others, with the different types of investors who want to enter the space, because if you don't come in there with the local knowledge, if you don't come in there with these relationships, it's going to be very hard. So all of the work that you all, everyone on the stage can be doing in collaboration with the others who want to enter the space and want to make a difference is, what we are here to do and drive. And so, yay. But thanks to that, and we are getting really close on time, but we are not going to leave without hearing first from Ella Lazarte, who, as I said, has spent a lot of an illustrious career in this space from a slightly different angle and can offer a different kind of perspective. Sorry, we're giggling at this point. But Ella, from your work in mobilizing private capital and market finance, deeply across lots of different countries, which models showed the most traction from investors and separately from governments? Across the portfolio of countries where you've worked, what became your quick pressure tests, indicators of success or red flags about failure, get out, this isn't worth the investment? How are you transferring or applying these learnings to the efforts of the Resilient Water Accelerator to help build the pipeline of investable projects that we all know is so desperately needed?
It's a lot.
Big questions.
Big question. Thanks so much. I'm actually taking this opportunity to reflect a little bit on some of the work that I was leading when I was at USAID, which all of you know is not there anymore. So it's great to actually take some time and look at what we've done and share a little bit of the lessons and that I will be taking with me as I took on this new role as the new CEO of the Resilient Water Accelerator. And before that, I see some old colleagues in the room. I was also at the World Bank promoting domestic private sector participation and also mobilizing finance. And it has been, I can say this now, it's 5:20. It's been a hard road. And I am not here to tell you, and don't worry, I said this in my job interview as well, so this is not, it's hard to mobilize private capital. And a lot of people in this room will say that. I think Sophie spent quite a bit of time, and Rob as well, talking about the enabling environment. When I came into USAID 9 years ago, we had a goal of, I think it was $200 million to mobilize private commercial finance into the sector. And at the end of it, we got to, this was the first phase of the WashFin program, about 120, and it was not private. It was public. Probably about 20%, 25% was private. And I'm not here to depress everybody, but it's really not to not sugarcoat the reality. And I think it's really, before I continue with that more depressing note, I do want to look at some bright spots because it's important to learn from them. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple examples because you were asking about models. Investors want to make sure that there's a clear cost recovery model, a business model, where you can that they can get their money back. And so an example was Cambodia, private water operators, so quite a distinct, very different from the DIB in the water sector. The private operators needed to expand, and initially some people were offering concessional rates. Our team said, you know what, we need to make this sustainable. Local domestic banks should and can invest in it. So we worked, so talking about capacity building, which is also a theme here, worked alongside private water providers to actually help them access loans that are much less than what the market was then offering. So we're talking about, this was a few years ago, so the market conditions were great. So we're talking about 13, 14% down to 7 to 8%. Just from the capacity building we were doing, looking at business plans, investment planning with the operators, and they're able to do that through the training and that, I know, the fly, that we did. And I think that's encouraging because there are those things that one can do, but it's working with the local financial institutions, working with the providers to make sure that you de-risk the investments and then you can reduce the interest rates. Another one, the Benin example, I will not go through. I think that's also a good one. Another one that they like, and again, maybe there's a theme here, so more of the financing facility or a fund, not a one-off transaction, but pooling investments together in a portfolio. So the Water Access Acceleration Fund that USAID invested in, we didn't invest that much. I invested my time talking about it. I'm not part of their technical advisory committee, but it was less than $1 million of USAID funding that leveraged 3-point-something million that then got to about 63 million euros at financial close a couple months ago. That's investing in SMEs, so in the water and sanitation space, water technologies, the centralized pipes infrastructure. So it's really important to look at that catalytic capital that's needed to unlock investments and de-risk it. Another one that I wanted to, and I know I'm trying to balance low income versus middle income, high income, the Philippines. The Philippine Water Revolving Fund went on to mobilize over $200 million in commercial, this is from local domestic commercial banks, but through the Public Development Bank, the Development Bank of the Philippines, and it was a partnership between the Japanese government, JICA, USAID, and the Development Bank of the Philippines that managed to unlock $200 million from the local market. And this is working with, in contrast to the Cambodia example, which is private water operators, this was working with local water districts. But it stopped for many reasons, and one of them was they were in need of some enabling environment reforms. Enter regulatory reforms that Sophie now mentioned, that OECD supporting, among other things. And so now, I think what's really important, and this gets me to, again, my last reflection on it, is, so for the Philippine Water Revolving Fund, it's quite a dated example, but it remains to be one of the more powerful examples that we have in the sector. It was concessional funding from the Development Bank of the Philippines, and then also through the commercial banks, and then you got longer tenors, lower interest rates. So how do you replicate that? How do you do that now? So it was actually through the development, they're now trying to replicate it. The Philippine government just approved basically a national sector financing framework, because we have to think about it at the national level. At the end of, and so that sector framework financing strategy actually tried to allocate the different budgets to where it makes sense, where's the viability gap funding going, where's market financing, where's the grant, and try to segment the market nationally. And it's really important to do that, because what Gouffran was saying earlier today, from the example in Ghana, 70, 80% viability gap funding is needed. And that's not going to change. Even the Benin example, I think Jane's here, she was part of that transaction from IFC. I think that was 80 to 90%. I worked in Mozambique. We were trying to set up a water fund for secondary cities. We estimated about 50 to 75% viability gap funding for concession contracts in secondary cities, and that's consolidating. So there's also the importance of economies of scale and clustering. So the last bit I want to say is, all this talk about private capital, we need public funding, and we need to spend it smartly, and we need to allocate it smartly, because otherwise we're never going to reach the SDGs and fill the financing gap. As much as we want private capital to enter, we need that to actually then catalyze private investments. So I'll end with that. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you, Ella. We're really close on time because I would love to open this up for conversations, for questions. What I heard here and heard reflected a lot is really the role of collaboration with the government and alignment with national priorities is the driver for what is going to incentivize more finance from the different angles. But you don't need to hear from me anymore because I am amazingly running out of energy, and I wanted to pass the last words off to somebody who theoretically has a lot more energy than me still to spare. And so with that, I'm going to, for the last moment, briefly welcome Sajid Mahanta from Waste Netherlands, and he's going to reflect on what he's been able to hear today, in addition to what Waste has been driving in East Africa, as well as India. So I guess we'll, we're so low on time, I'm concerned. Yeah, please. Oh, okay, maybe not. Sorry.
Hi, thank you for, am I audible? Yeah. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. We're running out of time, and it's very, very difficult to round up the whole conversation in 5 minutes because it was such an enriching conversation. And just to focus on a few points that we have all been talking, and we have been talking about enabling environment, and these are really systems change. These are really like magic concepts, and everybody likes to talk about it, but we are talking about it because there is a need for it. And we see from all the cases, also from the panelists now, that it's a real need to work with all the 4 stakeholders. At Waste, we work with stakeholders, including the financiers, the communities, or the beneficiaries, let's say, but also the businesses. It's very important that we work together with the wash businesses. We have seen in our sanitation program, Finish Mondial, that we have, it's a market-based sanitation approach, where we work a lot with MFIs to invest in household sanitation, but we also work with businesses in the sanitation service chain. But when they grow bigger, the small businesses, it's very difficult for the microfinance to fund them because they're too big for a microfinance institute, but they're also too small for a large bank. So this missing middle, it's very difficult to finance, and that we have not been able to crack. But we have a program called Take a Stake where there are challenges, of course, but we have been able to mobilize investment pipelines for these small businesses that are in the sanitation service chain and the value chain. And it's also important to kind of know that the whole sanitation service chain, all these sectors require different financing modalities. So one financing method cannot be applied to all the financing modalities, cannot be same for all the different segments. So it's very important to recognize that. And lastly, we have talked a lot about partnerships, so it's very important that we partner with each other to share the challenges, for instance, from your work in Cambodia and how results-based financing was working in Cambodia from your program is very important for us to know as well. And the market readiness that I think Rob talked about in the beginning is very important to consider because we have seen results-based financing was working in India for us because the market demand was something else, the readiness in India was something else. But in Bangladesh, we see that the market is already saturated with income-generating loans for microfinance. So there is not a real need for us to incentivize the MFIs in Bangladesh. So these are some things that it's important to nuance and not only talk about financing methods that are like one size fits all kind of a situation. The context is very important, and also the call for partnerships and call for action, because we are in dialogue, and this morning we also had dialogue with some of the development banks. But we should move ahead of the dialogues and also call for action. So that's what I wanted to say, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody here for being here. I know we are extending your time. This is late in the day, late in the week. I hope you've learned something about sort of the interrelation between the theory, the practice, and how we need all of the different actors to come together. There is a role that we all have to play in this. It's not just for them to solve. It's not just for them to solve. We all cross-learn and work on this together. I hope you find and chat and have more deep and detailed conversations with everybody that we've been able to bring together today. And we also do want to share, if you have takeaways, we do think we can generate a little word cloud to sort of hopefully inspire you on your way out. And then we wish you a really happy rest of World Water Week and moving forward.